Good day to all of you. Thank you for joining our APCMFM E-Zone webinar. It is a great honor for me to have my mentor here to give us an update on prediction and prevention of preeclampsia. Professor Nicolaides is the founder of the Fetal Medicine Foundation and is the director of the Fetal Medicine Research Institute at the King's College Hospital, London. He is the mastermind behind the first trimester prediction of preeclampsia, and I had the privilege to be his student and now a collaborator. Before the lecture, I would like to thank our sponsors of the meeting, Sonosmed and Chien. We'll play a short video for these sponsors, and then we'll go into the lecture.
Preeclampsia is a severe type of hypertensive disorder of pregnancy, which is the second leading cause of maternal mortality. By proactive screening and prevention, 50% of maternal deaths can be avoided. Ningbo Alchir Biotechnology Company Limited has been focusing on women and children's health for more than 10 years. We have developed a preeclampsia risk assessment and management system that includes instruments, reagents, and AI models, and initiated a real-world study on preeclampsia screening and prevention in China, which has been included in the 14th Five-Year Plan Key Special Project. With our efforts, the project of Gestation Hypertension and Preeclampsia Screening and Prevention Center is carrying out successively in various regions across China. This will provide evidence-based standards and guidelines for Chinese people, improving the medical level and women's rights in less developed areas. We are Alchir, a Chinese professional brand.
Thank you. I think so. Basically, we are also broadcasting to mainland China, and we will have a Chinese subtitle. So I invite Professor Nicolaides to speak a little bit slowly so that our Chinese colleagues can fully understand your lecture. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leona, for the invitation to talk on a topic for which we have worked for many years together. So your contribution in this field is enormous. Preeclampsia for me is important because it is a main cause of death. More than 45,000 women in the world die every year, and more than 500,000 fetuses and neonates also die as a result of this condition. For those of you that want to hear more about prediction, prevention, and management of preeclampsia, we have a very good review from last year in the New England Journal of Medicine. Tori Bao is a beautiful woman. She's an Olympic champion, 4 times Olympic champion. She died 6 months ago. She was 32 years old, and she died at 32 weeks into pregnancy as a result of preeclampsia. So preeclampsia is not an arbitrary condition for which we always say it is a serious complication of pregnancy, but it is a lethal complication of pregnancy. Now, when it comes to the diagnosis of the condition, over the years, you have seen an evolution in the different definitions of the condition. In the past, preeclampsia was hypertension plus proteinuria developing in the second half of pregnancy. Now, you can have hypertension without proteinuria, but with evidence of neurological, hematological, renal, hepatic dysfunction, and that is also classified as preeclampsia. We have the American College definition, and we have the International Society of Hypertension in Pregnancy definition, which actually is milder in a sense. It includes more cases of gestational hypertension now being classified as preeclampsia. As part of the definition of the International Society, there is also a component which requires that there may be uteroplacental dysfunction, and this is defined as fetal death or fetal growth restriction. And more recently, even the presence of abnormal angiogenic markers at screening are also included. What does that mean? Hypertension with low PLGF and or high FLT1 is also now classified as preeclampsia. Now, the traditional way of identifying women at high risk of preeclampsia in England, the United States, and I'm sure in the vast majority of countries in the world, depend on a risk scoring system. We ask women a few questions, and if the answer to these questions is yes, then you are called high risk for preeclampsia. And if the answer to the questions, all of the questions, or some of the questions is no, then you're considered to be at low risk for preeclampsia. The high risk factors are previous preeclampsia, chronic hypertension, chronic renal disease, diabetes, and autoimmune disease. And if you don't have these five, then you're asked another 5 or 6 questions. And then if the answer to 2 of these questions is yes, then again, you're considered to be at high risk. And these are first pregnancy, advanced maternal age, high body mass index, long interval between this and the previous pregnancy, and the family history of preeclampsia. And in the United States, if you are Black or poor, and quite often the two coincide. But if we were to look at this as a method of screening, we need to identify 2 parameters with all methods of screening. The first one is, what is the proportion of the condition that you are screening for that you include in the screen positive group? What is the detection rate or sensitivity? And what is the proportion of the population that you classify as being at high risk, so the screen positive rate? And you can see that the screen positive rate is about 10%, and the detection rate is 40%. So in terms of screening for preeclampsia, we are exactly where we used to be about 50 years ago in screening for Down syndrome. We were asking people, how old are you? And then you were classified as high or low risk, whether you were over or above the age of 35. It was simple. It did not cost any money, but it was as bad as screening for preeclampsia is now. The screen positive rate was about 10%, and the detection rate was 40%. We have moved on in screening for Downs over the decades. This is a picture from a publication we had in 1992, more than 30 years ago, where we said, yes, maternal age is interesting, and it should be the starting point, but in addition to maternal age, we can now look at the fluid behind the baby's neck, the measurement of nuchal translucency, plus the results of some hormones in the mother's blood, PABA, and free beta HCG. And when you combine these new approaches, we achieve 2 things. The first, we reduce the screen positive rate from 10 to 5%, and we improve the detection rate from 30 to 40% to about 90%. So the question is, can we also advance into the last 30 years from the previous 50 years in screening for preeclampsia? If we were to do so, the procedure would look like this. We will ask women some questions from her history and her characteristics, and that would give us the starting risk, the prior risk, and then we will measure various biochemical, biophysical tests and modify the prior risk to get the posterior risk, the final risk. So this is what we have been doing for many, many years now. And the method of screening that has been proposed by the Fetal Medicine Foundation is the triple test. What is this triple test? We take into consideration various characteristics from the maternal history, age, weight, race, previous preeclampsia, the mother had preeclampsia, conception by in vitro fertilization, chronic hypertension, diabetes, autoimmune disease. And then we measure the uterine artery pulsatility index with Doppler at 12 weeks, mean arterial pressure, and placental growth factor. And when we do that, and we have a comparison between the traditional method, the risk scoring method, against the Fetal Medicine Foundation triple test, we have these results. And this is what we did in several hospitals in England. And the detection rate of early preeclampsia before 34 weeks, preterm preeclampsia before 37 weeks, and term preeclampsia with the Fetal Medicine Foundation blue triple test was twice as good as that with the traditional method. So it is obvious that as in screening for Down syndrome, in screening for preeclampsia, a main cause of death for mothers and babies should also advance from what we used to have 50 years ago into what we should be offering women now. Now, in addition to developing a model, we carried out a series of trials to find out the calibration and validation. What does this mean? Well, you do the original model, and then you have to have other studies to confirm your results. Are the results of the original model as good as we predicted? Number one. Number two, what is calibration? Calibration means that when you tell a woman your risk for Downs, your risk for preeclampsia, your risk for prostate cancer is 1 in 2, a man, then if we follow 100 people with a risk of 1 in 2, 50 would get the condition that we predicted. And if we tell people that your risk is 1 in 1,000, and we follow 1,000 people up, only one should turn out to have the condition that we predicted. So on the horizontal axis, we plot the prediction, and on the vertical axis, we plot the observation of how many of the conditions that we predicted actually turn out to be true. And when we have a perfect agreement between prediction and observation, we have this diagonal blue line. Here we have 3 studies, a training set from the Fetal Medicine Foundation, 36,000 women, and we have a near agreement, perfect agreement between prediction and observation, and then a study, multi-center study in several European countries, 8,775, similarly good results, and another one of the hospitals that I mentioned in England, where we compared the scoring system with the Fetal Medicine Foundation. And then further studies were carried out, 5 regions in Spain involving more than 10,000 women. Again, we have an excellent relationship between prediction and observation, and then a study carried out by the group of Leona Thun in 7 Asian populations in more again than 10,000 women, and you have a very good correlation between what you predict and what you find. And even more recently, we have a study from 5 university hospitals in Denmark. And again, this is showing a very good relationship between prediction and observation. We have also used the data from more than 60,000 women, and a professor of artificial intelligence has used this data to develop a model. And again, we had very similar prediction using artificial intelligence as our previous model. So we have a very good method of prediction in the first trimester of premature preeclampsia, and this method has been validated in several studies, and there's an excellent correlation between what you predict and what you observe. I want to summarize in this slide something else which people often ask. The best method of screening for preterm preeclampsia and early preeclampsia is by the triple test: mean arterial pressure, uterine artery Doppler, placental growth factor. Detection of 90% of early preeclampsia, 75% of preterm preeclampsia. But if you say, but we are very poor, we don't have money to measure placental growth factor. How much is this placental growth factor? It's about $5 to $10 per patient. It's not a lot for a condition that is so very important. But you say we don't have the money. Well, then you do mean arterial pressure and uterine artery Doppler, and your detection rate is 83 rather than 90%, 68 rather than 75. Or you say, we do have money to measure PLGF, but we are not very good in Doppler. Well, then you do a double test, mean arterial pressure, placental growth factor, and again, the performance is a little bit worse, but still a lot better than nothing. It's the same, really, as in screening for Down syndrome. The best test is the triple test, where you measure the nuchal and pupillary HCG and PABA. But if you don't have money to measure the biochemistry, instead of a detection rate of 90%, well, you have a detection rate of 80%, a lot better than nothing, but not as good as the full triple test. There's another important element about screening. When we screen, we fix a cutoff to classify people as positive and negative, and we can fix this cutoff to achieve a screen positive rate that we want, 10%, 15%, 20%, and then we look at the detection rate. But you can do the opposite. You can fix the desired detection rate and then find out what would be the screening positive proportion of the population to achieve that desired detection rate. So here we have a desire for a detection of 75% of preterm preeclampsia. With the triple test, we need a screen positive rate of 10%. With the double test, we need to classify as screen positive about 15%. If we wanted to have an even better performance of screening, a detection rate of 80%, with the triple test, we can achieve that with a 15% screen positive rate, but with the double test, either uterine or PLGF, we need to classify 17 to 19% of the population as screen positive. Now, that is trying to identify the high-risk group for preterm preeclampsia. The next question is, what can we do to this group? What is not useful is to ask the women to stay in bed and to give them various medications like magnesium or zinc or folic acid or vitamins or fish oil. These have been proven not to be useful. The only things that have been discussed extensively as being useful are calcium and aspirin. Let us look at calcium. Here we have the Cochrane Library, which is considered to be the ultimate level of evidence in medicine, where people are doing meta-analysis and they are meant to produce the best available evidence. And you have this group led by Professor Hofmeyr from South Africa that has written many Cochrane reviews. And in reality, in the context of calcium, he wrote one in 2002, and then 2004, and then 2006, and then 2010, and 14, and 18. And what they were finding in the same 13 studies involving 15,700 women was that calcium is really good, especially in populations with a low calcium intake. It reduces the rate of preeclampsia by 55%. Fantastic. As a result of these publications, the World Health Organization has strongly recommended that calcium should be used in pregnancy to prevent preeclampsia and its complications. So here we are, very good evidence, supported by the most important organization of the World Health Organization. But how good is really the evidence? Here is a summary of these magical 13,000 studies, 13 studies which involve about 15,000 women. Let's look at them. There's a study by Villa involving 8,300 women. 50% of the total evidence comes from this study, and that study showed that calcium is not useful. And then you have another study from the famous Levine, who wrote the New England Journal paper on FLEET and PLGF, but unfortunately subsequently died, involving 4,500 women. Again, no evidence. When you combine the information from Villard and Levine, we account for 80% of the total evidence. So two proper massive studies show no evidence of usefulness. And then we have a series of silly, biased studies with a minute number of 15, 30 patients, 50 patients, 60 patients, 70 patients. And these small studies are producing fantastic results. And then we put everything together and we mix them up. And we use this random effects model, which is the proper way of doing meta-analysis, where the importance of a study involving 8,500 women is almost the same as the importance of a silly study involving 30,000 women, and then it's a magic. Now, suddenly, the calcium supplementation produces this major reduction in risk of 55%. But I want to draw your attention to this number, I squared. What is this? This is the Higgins number, which tells you how heterogeneous, how different are the various studies. And the factor is 70%. And there is a very clear statement from Higgins that if you have a heterogeneity which is very, very high, you must not do a meta-analysis. So it's extraordinary that the Cochrane library, the ultimate level of medicine, does not know that, does not know the very basic principle of how to perform a meta-analysis. And they produce ridiculous results, misleading results that become the ethos of the WHO. The conclusion for me is that there is no evidence that calcium is useful in the prevention of preeclampsia. And yet, the National Institute of Health and Research in England has recently funded a study of comparing aspirin with aspirin plus calcium. And this study, which has cost the people of England £2 million, started in November 2020. It is meant to finish in 2025. And in the last 3 years, they managed to recruit 3.6% of the total number of patients of 7,756 that they needed. This study that is wasting the money of the people of England and is delaying the discussion about proper implementation of screening and prevention of preeclampsia with aspirin, clouding the issue. In the absence of proper evidence that calcium is useful, it's going to be another negative trial. Aspirin. Aspirin was proposed as a method of prevention of preeclampsia 40 years ago. In this publication in The Lancet, where they took 102 women at high risk of preeclampsia, and to some they gave aspirin and to others they did not. 150 milligrams of aspirin from 12 weeks onwards. Blue is the aspirin, no cases of preeclampsia, fetal death, fetal growth restriction. Red at the cases that did not receive aspirin, and the high proportion of the women developed preeclampsia, had stillbirths, or fetal growth restriction. 40 years ago, aspirin, 150 milligrams in the high-risk group, starting from 12 weeks. Full stop. What happened in the subsequent years? People did silly, ridiculous studies. They started giving 40 milligrams, 60 milligrams, 75 milligrams, 80 milligrams. And only 2 of the 23 trials gave the proper dose of aspirin. And then they started giving aspirin at 12, 14, 18, 20, 28, 32 weeks. So as if nobody had read the original publication, they did this series of wasteful, silly studies that dominated the field in the next 40 years. And then somebody comes along, puts all of these studies, which are completely heterogeneous, together in this magic called the meta-analysis, which says, don't worry, give any dose of aspirin. It doesn't really matter how much you give. It doesn't matter when you start or when you finish, just give a bit or a lot, and you will reduce the rate of preeclampsia by 10%. Not great. This history of the last 40 wasted years was at the expense of maternal and fetal death. And then, together with Leona, we carried out a proper study. And what is a proper study? It is a study where you use the Fetal Medicine Foundation method of screening, the triple test, identify the high-risk group at the beginning of the pregnancy, randomize them, and give a proper dose of aspirin, 150 milligrams from 12 to 36 weeks against placebo. And when you do that, you see something extraordinary. You reduce the rate of early preeclampsia by 90%, of preterm preeclampsia by 60%, but there is no impact on term preeclampsia. This is extremely important. Proper identification of the high-risk group, proper methodology reduces dramatically the most important cause of death, and that is of preeclampsia before 32 weeks, but it has no impact on term preeclampsia. It is very clear, and the paper in the New England Journal of Medicine was extraordinarily clear. Another important finding of the study is that in the group that received aspirin, there was a dramatic reduction in neonatal intensive care. And in obstetrics, the main cause of cost is birth before 32 weeks. The cost in England of neonatal intensive care is £2,500 every day. The total cost for a baby that is born very prematurely is more than £100,000, because many of the babies that survive end up having varying degrees of handicap. The total cost for the British government of looking after babies, adults that have been born very prematurely, is more than £3 billion per year. And all of this, to a great extent, can be saved by proper implementation of first trimester screening and prevention of preterm preeclampsia. But what happened against this overwhelming evidence? The Cochrane database again. The same group of people that have read the paper, they said aspirin prevents preterm, not term preeclampsia. They ignore that evidence, and they do another meta-analysis, and they show that it doesn't really matter how much aspirin you take, when do you take it. There were some studies that were giving aspirin at 38 weeks, at the end, maybe aspirin reduces the total preeclampsia, not preterm, total preeclampsia by about 18%. Again, you are fighting a battle against the dark forces of ignorance. Again, studies like this, of completely heterogeneous studies, ridiculous studies with a ridiculous outcome, find their way in the ultimate level of evidence in medicine, the Cochrane database, and they set us back by another 40 years for more babies and more women to die. And what has the government, the NIHR, done? Instead of introducing in a proper way screening in England, they have now given funding of £4.6 million for another trial of comparing NICE guidelines, the risk scoring system that we know is much, much worse than the Fetal Medicine Foundation triple test. But instead of having an outcome called preeclampsia, the outcome becomes iatrogenic preterm birth. So we have recently published in the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology that first trimester screening for preeclampsia screens and identifies preeclampsia. It does not identify iatrogenic preterm birth. And aspirin prevents preeclampsia. It does not prevent iatrogenic preterm birth for any other reasons other than preeclampsia. So it is very, very clear that this study that has now cost £4.6 million, that will take at least 5 years to give results, will be another negative study that will set us back for another few decades. Very, very sad. But I'm very angry. I'm very angry on behalf of the people that suffer from a condition that can kill them and can kill their babies. Let us now move to term preeclampsia. We have said that first trimester screening is good for preterm prediction, not term prediction, and is good with aspirin for prevention of preterm, not term preeclampsia. Is term preeclampsia important? Does it really matter? The blue histograms are for preterm preeclampsia. It is absolutely true that preterm preeclampsia increases and is much more important in terms of the incidence of severe hypertension, maternal mortality and morbidity, perinatal mortality, neonatal unit admission for more than 48 hours, and very low birth weight. But if we look on the left, the incidence of preterm preeclampsia is only 0.7%, and that of term preeclampsia is much, much higher. So although the individual risk from preterm preeclampsia is higher for adverse outcomes, because there is a lot more term than preterm preeclampsias, the contribution of term preeclampsia to the severe hypertension, severe maternal mortality and morbidity, and many of the perinatal adverse outcomes is even more important with term rather than preterm preeclampsia. And we need to do something to predict and prevent preterm preeclampsia. Summary: first trimester screening, good for prediction of early and preterm, not term preeclampsia. Aspirin, good for prevention of early and preterm, but not term preeclampsia. What can we do? Well, we did a study of screening at 36 weeks, and we identified the high-risk group amongst nearly 30,000 women. And we randomized the high-risk group into a group that received pravastatin, 20 milligrams every day against placebo. And we are very, very disappointed after this enormous effort to find that pravastatin, 20 milligrams given to a high-risk group at 36 weeks, does not prevent term preeclampsia. What else can we do? Well, we go back to this very nice study from Grobman in the United States, in Chicago, where they took low-risk, healthy women in their first pregnancy at 38 weeks, and they randomly allocated them into two groups. In one group, they induced labor at the beginning of the 39th week, and in the other group, they followed up the women expectantly. There was no difference between the group, significant difference in perinatal death or severe neonatal complications. However, contrary to expectation, in the induction of labor group, there was a reduction, not an increase, a reduction in the rate of cesarean delivery, and there was a substantial reduction in the rate of hypertensive diseases, and this makes sense. If a woman is going to develop preeclampsia tomorrow, and you know it in advance, and you deliver her the day before, you are preventing the preeclampsia that she would deliver the next day. Based on this evidence, we are conducting now a major study that I hope we will finish by March next year, where we are doing screening at 36 weeks for everybody. I think that all women should have assessment of their risks by routine ultrasound examination and biochemistry at 12, 20, and 36 weeks. And on the basis of this risk, we can then decide a personalized management of the subsequent course of their pregnancy. If you have an extremely high risk of 1 in 2 or more, then that is only a very small proportion of the population. We should be delivering them at 37 weeks. With less risk, about 2 to 3% of the population deliver them at 38, 39, 40, and 41. And we have estimated that in doing so, we will dramatically reduce the rate of preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, fetal growth restriction, and fetal distress in labor. We will know if this hypothesis is true or not, as I mentioned in the beginning of next year. Let me now talk about preeclampsia in twins. The incidence of preeclampsia in twin pregnancies by comparison with singleton pregnancies is about 3 times higher. But because the vast majority of the twins will deliver before 37 weeks, a better comparison of preeclampsia is between preterm preeclampsia in singletons versus twins. And if we look at that, then the risk in twin pregnancies is 9 times higher than in singleton pregnancies. So all twins are at very, very high risk of developing preeclampsia. Can we do something about that? Well, it is not clear from any evidence that aspirin in twins is useful. So we are conducting a study that will take another 3 years to identify twin pregnancies in the beginning of the 12th week, and then randomize them into aspirin, 150 milligrams against placebo, to find out if aspirin in twins is as good as it is in singletons. It is not certain that it will be. We need to prove it one way or another. Let me go to the last part of my lecture, and that is, which are the useful biomarkers for preeclampsia? In the first trimester of pregnancy is mean arterial pressure, uterine artery Doppler, and placental growth factor. In the second and early third trimester, it's the same. Also FLIT, which goes up about 5 weeks before the clinical onset of the disease. And in the end of the third trimester, uterine artery Doppler is not useful. At the bottom, I have this OA ratio, and that is the ophthalmic artery ratio, which is useful in the first, second, and third trimester. There has been some discussion about PAB-A. People say that we are using PAB-A in screening for Downs. It is useful not to pay money to measure PLGF because PAB-A is as good as PLGF. This is completely wrong. PAB-A is not a useful first trimester screening method for preeclampsia. placental growth factor is. And this is the evidence that we published last year in the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology on 25,000 pregnancies at 11 to 15 weeks. Placental growth factor is red, PAB-A is blue. Once you have measured mean arterial pressure and certainly uterine artery Doppler, PAB-A does not add anything to your screening, whereas PLGF is useful with or without mean arterial pressure and uterine artery Doppler. Conclusion: a proper first trimester method of screening for preeclampsia is called mean arterial pressure, uterine artery Doppler, and placental growth factor, not PAB-A. There has been a lot of discussion about cardiac function in pregnancy and its potential value in the prediction of preeclampsia. We have carried out a study involving 4,800 women, actually now more than 6,000 women, that we routinely carried out maternal echocardiography at 20 weeks in pregnancy. The vertical black line is normality. The horizontal lines are from women that subsequently developed preeclampsia. And you can see very clearly that there is no evidence of maternal cardiac dysfunction before the clinical onset of preeclampsia, except for one thing: peripheral vascular resistance in red, which is increased in the women that will subsequently develop preeclampsia. And I suspect this vasculopathy may well be present even before the woman gets pregnant. And if you have this increased susceptibility to preeclampsia because of vascular problems, then that is why you develop preeclampsia. And that is why you have a long-term increased cardiovascular risk for these women that have developed preeclampsia. Not a heart problem, a vascular problem. But we cannot measure peripheral vascular resistance in women by doing extensive maternal echocardiography. What you can do, however, is look in the eye. The ophthalmic artery is the first branch of the internal carotid artery. When the woman has a scan and she's lying in bed, you put a bit of gel on the transducer, and then you put the transducer on top of the upper eyelid, and then it's magic. You have a big black ball. That is the orbit. We put the color on, and there's only one vessel, and that is the ophthalmic artery. And it produces a characteristic double systolic wave and then diastole. The first wave is from contraction of the heart and blood going into the brain. Then the blood moves to the periphery, it meets arterioles, and it is reflected back into the heart and back into the brain, and then you produce the second wave. The first wave is a reflection of cardiac contractility. The second wave is a reflection of peripheral vascular resistance. So here we have a method which takes a few seconds to do. Anybody can do it. It is not as confusing or difficult as the assessment of the uterine artery, and it produces very good results. Studies that we carried out in the third, second, and first trimester. The blue horizontal line is normality. The red circles are from women that have developed preeclampsia, and you can see that already a few days, a few weeks, a few months before the clinical onset of preeclampsia, the second wave, by comparison with the first, the peripheral resistance wave is increased in the women that will develop preeclampsia. And this is a very simple conclusion, that using the ophthalmic artery Doppler, we can replace the uterine artery Doppler in the first trimester prediction of preeclampsia with very, very similar results. So the argument that often I hear from people, particularly in the United States, it's very difficult to do uterine artery Doppler. I tell them, don't worry about it. Don't do it. Just look at the ophthalmic artery, which is very easy to do. And finally, work that but also the team of Leona Poon has done is this very simple point of care, a drop of blood in this very small instrument, which is like the stick that you use for your data, and then into this machine that gives you results within 10 minutes as a perfect point of care test. We have done studies in the first and also in the third trimester. The horizontal blue line is normality, and the red circles are from women that subsequently developed preeclampsia. And you can see that you can potentially have a new test, which is first trimester triple test, but we can replace potentially placental growth factor with this glycosylated fibronectin. And similarly, in the third trimester, we can potentially replace placental growth factor and FLT with glycosylated fibronectin. But we have done these studies, Leona has done these studies, and now we need more extensive evidence around this biomarker. So I thank you for your attention. Preeclampsia of the most severe type, preterm, is predictable and preventable, and it is important that in England, the government and the governments of other countries stop wasting time, money, and energy on inappropriate studies, but they find ways of implementing this for the prevention of maternal and perinatal death. For term preeclampsia, there is a methodology where we can identify and potentially reduce the disease. And for twins, we need more research to find out if aspirin is also useful. So I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Nicolaides, for a very comprehensive overview of the topic. And I'm sure the audience has really learned a lot from this talk, and I've learned new things as well. And there are actually a couple of questions already, and if it's okay with you, I will refer to them. And I think you've already touched on term preeclampsia. So there is one question in relation to prediction and prevention of term preeclampsia, and obviously first trimester prediction isn't as good, and then now we are going down to the third trimester visit, as you have highlighted in your ongoing trial, that you provide combined screening, and then you triage women of different risk categories into different time point for induction of labor. What if it is not possible for us to provide universal screening at 35 weeks of gestation? Any thoughts on this?
It's very simple, Leona. In the old days, there was no ultrasound in pregnancy. And then people started doing scans at 16 weeks. And then we realized at 16 weeks, you're too young to know, but I remember very well. At 16 weeks, ultrasound was really bad. We couldn't properly examine the baby. And then we moved the scan to 20 weeks. And then in 1992, after the association of nuchal translucency with Downs, we introduced, and in many countries they introduced, a 12-week scan. And in England, and in other poor countries like England, that's it. But in other societies in Europe, they started doing a scan at 32 weeks to identify growth problems in the third trimester. We have done extensive studies and found that that is not good enough for the prediction of problems at term. And therefore, we have now introduced, it's already 10 years, a scan at 36 weeks. And it is very clear for me that all pregnant women should have a minimum of 3 scans, 12, 20, and 36. Why 36? Because we can then identify small babies and big babies, oligohydramnios and polyhydramnios, can identify certain major third trimester type of abnormalities, and we can assess the risk for preeclampsia. So to me, there's no compromise anymore. A primitive way that we have in England of assessing fetal growth and well-being with a measuring tape it's extraordinarily idiotic in my mind that it could be advanced as an argument of modern pregnancy care. All women should have a scan at 36 weeks. And if we do have such a scan, taking a history that we have already done from 12 weeks and measuring the blood pressure as a minimum will give you and go a long way towards identifying a high-risk group for development of preeclampsia. Now, if you have more money, and you can also do glycosylated fibronectin or placental growth factor and FLIT, so much the better. So whether you like it or not, this will come.
Thank you. There's one question in relation to the gestational age window when we need to do first trimester screening. And I think the answer is very obvious. It's 11 to 13 weeks. I don't want to bother you with that. And then whether we do the screening at a single time point, again, you've demonstrated very clearly that we do indeed, in terms of first trimester screening, is one single time point. There's one question
Well, let
in
me
relation.
answer partly that
Yeah.
question,
Okay.
Leona,
Yeah.
because some people are now saying, but why not give aspirin to women before that? Because the only realistic time where we can do effective screening is at 11 to 15 weeks. There is increasing evidence now. There are studies that have measured placental growth factor at 9 to 10 weeks and also at 11 to 12 weeks. And they find that although at 11 to 13 weeks, placental growth factor is beneficial in distinguishing between the women that will from the women that will not develop preeclampsia, placental growth factor at 9 and 10 weeks is not useful.
That's very helpful because indeed, we do have a lot of questions in relation to when they should start aspirin and whether it can be done beforehand. And at the moment, our recommendation is that actually we should wait until we perform screening 11, 13 weeks. And for those who are high risk, we give aspirin. Also, my biggest concern in relation to starting aspirin before 11 weeks is that there's a lot of vaginal spotting and therefore we can't really ensure compliance. And I think that is quite a major challenge. There's one question in relation to emerging data on first trimester exposure to progesterone and preeclampsia prevention. I've just seen that meta-analysis, and well, the first thing that came to my mind is fascinating. Any comments from you?
Yes. Is it published now, Leona, this study?
Yes, it's from Ari. Yeah. I saw it. I don't remember the journal, but it's been published.
I was asked to be a co-author and I refused. It's a very confusing study because it's at the back of women that were bleeding in early pregnancy and they were given progesterone. And by accident, they found that in that group, there was potentially a reduction in the rate of preeclampsia. Completely irrelevant and inappropriate study because progesterone was given to women at 8 and 7 and 6 weeks because of bleeding. And if you gave it after that, it did not prevent preeclampsia. So it's an interesting publication. I respect and I love Ari, but it's useless in terms of how do you go forward. Yes, if they have women that are bleeding at 6 weeks, they should give them progesterone. And if they don't miscarry, maybe their risk of preeclampsia is reduced, but it has no benefit. You cannot take women at 10 weeks or 11 weeks or 12 weeks and give them progesterone and that reduces preeclampsia. It does not.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions. If you don't mind, we keep going.
It's a
in
pleasure.
In the concepts of universal preeclampsia screening, are there any pregnant women who should be exempted and given aspirin anyway, regardless of the results?
No. This question, Leona, takes us back to about 30 years ago, when people were saying we used to screen for Down syndrome by maternal age. And then we said, but now we have a much better method of combining maternal age with nuchal and 3-beta-HCG and PAVE. And they said, yes, but if the woman is 35 years old, isn't she still at risk? No, she's not. Because she's 35 years old, her risk is maybe about 1 in 300. But if the nuchal and the biochemistry is good, her risk becomes 1 in a few thousand. So just because in the old days, in a previous era, somebody at the age of 35 or 38 or 40 was at high risk, now she's not with the new biomarkers. Yes, a woman that had previous preeclampsia, yes, a woman who has diabetes or chronic hypertension is at increased starting risk for preeclampsia. But if all the biomarkers are perfect, actually her risk may be a lot less than that of women that do not have any of these maternal characteristics, but they have abnormal biomarkers. So I think that screening means everybody enters, we take into account your prior risk, we do the biomarkers, and then we define your posterior risk, and then decide on the basis of your posterior risk whether you should or not receive treatment. This is modern personalized medicine.
Totally agree with that. And because we need to remember that pregnancy from some years ago, I mean, the woman has also progressed and there could be new conditions, and we need to revisit the risk, not just purely based on her previous obstetric history. We need to assess the patient as a whole. So there's a question in relation to allergy to aspirin, and at the moment I wonder, do you have any suggestion?
Leona, I don't know whether you have any suggestions, but I haven't come across anybody that has this allergy. How common is this condition? Is it 1 in 10,000? I don't know.
It's quite
I
common
don't know
in
how
Asia.
common it is.
It's quite common
Is
in
it
Asia. It's more common in Asia.
interesting?
I've learned this while I'm here, and then so it is a major challenge, and right now, of course, we need to determine the severity of the allergy, and if it's actually related to non-steroidal, not particular aspirin, and obviously we go through the pros and cons and monitor very closely, and if the woman still wants to try aspirin, and we monitor closely, I think that's one consideration. And then I at the moment do not recommend the use of heparin for those with aspirin allergy. And then well, unfortunately, you have to wait until after the index pregnancy to see whether there's any consideration for treating the allergy after pregnancy. So because you anticipate
Yeah.
that the next pregnancy could also be at increased risk. So, but then, yeah, and this is a dilemma for us. And calcium, I know you've brought up the issue of calcium, and in our fecal best practice recommendation, we state that is a pragmatic consideration. And I think calcium is potentially very helpful in our population here because we don't really drink a lot of milk, we don't eat cheese. So actually our calcium intake is certainly lower than that of the European population. So this is something for us to consider as well.
Leona, you have seen the evidence and it will be published soon. And there is no scientific evidence that it is useful. And it's as simple as that. It's a historical accident and ignorance of how to conduct meta-analysis in the presence of enormous heterogeneity. You should not do that.
Yeah. So, well, time for us to update our fecal best practice recommendation anyway. So yes, thank you. Actually, this is a question again in relation to aspirin. I mean, you know, stated by the FDA that we should not give aspirin, and because you treat it as a non-steroidal agent, but then whether at the moment in my locality, certainly for high risk women, we give aspirin 160 milligrams. And in your setting, have you observed any increased concern with the use of aspirin amongst high risk women?
No.
Great.
But if we look at all of the trials with aspirin, there was no evidence of these hemorrhagic events, but it's a reality. We know that old men like me that take aspirin are at increased risk of dying from brain hemorrhages and gastrointestinal hemorrhage. So it's a fact. There is a very, very small risk of that happening, but it is a fact. And it is for this reason that it is very wrong to advocate the concept of let's give aspirin to everybody and not waste our time and our money in doing screening. We need to give aspirin to the group that require aspirin, and we need to carefully monitor the effectiveness of lower potential doses. I think that that should not be a block to implementation. I think it should be implemented properly. And then as part of this implementation, there should be a continuous observation for such adverse effects.
There are still about 10 questions to go. Are you okay with time?
Yes,
I
I
see.
am.
Fantastic. There's one question from mainland China, and then it's in relation to second and third trimester screening, because well, we don't actually have a preventative method right now. What is your recommendation when we find a high-risk case, other than the induction trial that you're undertaking?
So if we find a high-risk patient we have in the first trimester, we should give them aspirin. We do know that aspirin will prevent 90% of early, but only about 60% of preterm preeclampsia. So we cannot just give aspirin and ignore these women. They are at increased risk of preeclampsia, and we should be making them aware that if they develop any symptoms of preeclampsia, they should report to us, and we should measure their blood pressure more frequently. They are still a high risk. Let me again mention, identify high risk at 12 weeks. We identify the group that has a 75% detection rate for preterm, and we prevent 60% of the preeclampsia in this group. So there's still quite a few preterm preeclampsias that are neither predicted nor prevented. So high risk means we continue to monitor these women. Also, even in the low risk group, again, we must not give up on routine measurement of blood pressure during the course of the pregnancy. And I have mentioned the strategy for third trimester screening for term preeclampsia, which is more common and still severe for term preeclampsia.
In different gestational weeks of pregnant women, the single PLGF value changes greatly. What is the significance of using the single PLGF value to predict the risk of preeclampsia? Is there any reference recommendations for the reference range? Because of hospitals in many of our underdeveloped regions do not popularize ultrasound-related examinations, the accessibility of fully utilizing models is not going to be high. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. This is extremely important, and it is a very wrong thing to do in medicine, certainly in obstetrics, of taking a measurement from a machine, having a cutoff, and interpreting that for the whole population. Placental growth, alpha fetoprotein, I'm talking about 50 years ago. When you take a measurement of alpha fetoprotein, we realized that the measurement changes with gestation, that the measurement is different for different ethnic groups, that the measurement is different for different size of women, that the measurement is different if you smoke or if you don't smoke. The same is true with placental growth factor. It is silly, really wrong, to use a fixed cutoff for either PLGF or FLIT to PLGF ratio. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Because these measurements are completely dependent on gestational age, the size of the woman, the type of the woman. Different racial groups have different cutoffs, the method of conception, previous medical history. And unless we convert the measurements that come out of the machine into multiples of the median, to me, it's impossible and wrong to interpret results based on a simple cutoff. Wrong.
This is a challenge because we always go for the simple option, and that's not always the best
I know
option.
that obstetricians are very simple-minded people, but it is wrong because it is simple to use it, because it is simple, but it is wrong. It's bad medicine.
Any recommendation for future pregnancy of those who have developed preeclampsia despite aspirin use?
I think that there are clearly very high risk of developing preeclampsia again. And of course, it depends on which type of preeclampsia. Is it preeclampsia at 42 weeks, or is it preeclampsia at 28 weeks? I think we enter into the algorithm of the Fetal Medicine Foundation, the fact that they had developed preeclampsia and at what gestation, and that changes your prior risk, and then you reassess the risk again.
So in terms of OA measurement, ophthalmic artery Doppler measurement, and someone's asking for cutoffs, is precisely what you were talking about. I think, I don't know, you still have your slides there, and then I'm sure you want to respond to this. I keep saying that.
It's exactly the same, really.
Yes.
Biochemists, biochemistry, pre-beta HG, PAB. Now, everybody should know that there is no cutoff that is good or bad. There's a multiple of the median. In Down syndrome, the pre-beta HG is about 2 multiples of the median, not 173.5 milligrams. It is 2 multiples of the median. The same is true for PLGF, the same is true for Philip, and the same is true for biophysical measurements. And Leona Poon, in her thesis, showed that when we measure the blood pressure, even a systolic and diastolic blood pressure, the mean arterial pressure must also be adjusted for the maternal characteristics. And this is what I am showing for the peak systolic velocity. If you go into the website of the Fetal Medicine Foundation, www.fetalmedicine.com, and you put the values in and maternal characteristics, it gives you the MOM, the multiple of the median. And we are in the process of developing software now that I hope will be available in about 3 to 6 months, that will be made available to the whole world free of charge, so that they can have it like their stethoscope, and they can put some measurements now, ophthalmic artery, placental growth factor, whatever they want, and you will get a MOM value. And this is what this graph here is showing. Normality is 0, this peak systolic velocity ratio delta, and then high means above the adjusted value of PSV for various maternal characteristics.
I note that ophthalmic artery Doppler is not within your online calculator right now. Am I right that it will be brought in at some stage? There's one question about that.
6 months.
Okay. Any impact in terms on the performance with a retroverted, on the performance of uterine artery Doppler in a retroverted uterus? I would say no.
I haven't found something like that, but I'm willing to be educated.
No, I haven't seen it, because I've also I think because essentially the PI of the uterine artery is not really dependent on the angle of intonation, and therefore how the uterus is tilting, I don't think is going to have an impact on the PI measurement. In your opinion, what might be the role of cell-free RNA in the prediction of preterm preeclampsia? I'm sure you've seen the data from
None.
Stephen Quake.
None. It's another one of those gimmicks, really. RNA, DNA, molecular biology is very, very trendy now, and they are falling back into the same old mistake called omics, proteomics, spaghettomics, molecular biomics, where they take a small group of sample, they manipulate the data, and they find that the biomarker is extremely useful, and then they test it in another population, and they find that it's useless. It is a nice wishful thinking. It's not going to go anywhere. I know that.
We're looking at that. I'll share our data with you.
Please, if you think that is fantastic, let me know so that I take it on.
Well, we're coming to you and ask for your samples. Ha.
Okay.
Okay. So I see some questions in relation to more questions about gastritis and aspirin. And actually, in my practice, if I have a patient with upper GI symptoms on aspirin, I actually treat these patients with antacids or PPI, and usually within a week.
Imiprazole?
Yeah, no concern, and then that basically symptoms resolve. And then, because I think the trouble with aspirin in early pregnancy is that sometimes these women have pregnancy symptoms as well, and they can't really differentiate the pregnancy symptoms from aspirin-related symptoms. And I don't want them to give up, and so because the most critical time to take aspirin is before 16 weeks. So I really need to tie them
Yeah.
over until 16 weeks. So that's that. And then any role of not putting on too much weight in terms of preventing preeclampsia.
Of avoiding putting on weight.
Yes. Well, from
Yes,
your
a
mock
very good
trial,
idea.
yeah, yeah. I think you've
Excellent
demonstrated that
idea.
with your mock trial, with the use of metformin,
I think that
basically.
in the mock trial there was a surprising, very good result from the use of metformin in the prevention of preeclampsia. It was very surprising that, and I think that there is a place for further investigation on the value of metformin, especially in obese women. One of the major risk factors for preeclampsia from the history is maternal weight. So if somehow you can manage to reduce the maternal weight, it is likely that you will reduce the incidence of preeclampsia. I think that every single effort of dietary advice and exercise has failed miserably. This concept of what is called social engineering has failed miserably in reducing the incidence of obesity. Actually, if we look at obesity in the world, it's going like this, and you can go to the gym as many times as you want, and you can advise people as many times as you want, but the rate is going to continue to increase. Whether metformin or even the new semaglutide, for example, the new type of more effective ways of stopping your diet will prevent weight gain, and they will, perhaps in the pregnancy interval, rather than during the course of the pregnancy, then I think it's worthwhile doing research in that area.
Yeah, we are embarking on this major trial in
Good.
mainland China. Well, we'll see how it goes. And optimal dose is 150 milligrams. Yes, that's for aspirin. Yeah, aspirin. And do you give aspirin 150 milligrams till 36 weeks or beyond until just before birth?
I think it's worthwhile stopping really at 36 weeks because, I don't know, more than 95% of women will deliver after that gestation. And just in case, with a higher dose of aspirin, there are some uh, hemorrhagic implications for the mother and potentially the baby, it is best to avoid it because it doesn't really matter by that time. If you have avoided preeclampsia, you would have avoided it by then.
I think one last question. May I ask for your expert opinion? What causes women not to get the optimal benefit from aspirin on preeclampsia prevention?
I'm not quite sure what the question is, Leona.
Basically,
You
what are
mean?
the risk factors for developing preeclampsia despite aspirin prophylaxis?
Well, I think it is quite simple, really. First of all, you have published on it, but you do a risk assessment, and some women that would have an extremely high risk of preeclampsia, even if you substantially reduce that risk, because they started off with a very high risk, they have a residual risk. And it's a very simple mathematical conclusion. The higher the starting risk, the higher is the chance that even with aspirin and the reduction in the risk, you are still having a residual risk.
Yeah, yeah, that's very logical. Yes, and on this, we've finished with all the questions. And well, thank you so much. I'm sure
Thank
I've
you, Leona.
exhausted
Thank
you.
you for inviting me. Thank you.
Really, really great talk, and I think the audience appreciates all the information
And
all the
by the way,
information.
I take this opportunity in this audience to congratulate you for becoming the next but one president of ISWOC. I think that ISWOC will benefit. ISWOC and ultrasound in the world will benefit from your presidency. And I look forward to seeing you in London in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much, and
Okay.
thank you for so much engagement from the audience. I think that the questions are very, it shows that they are very engaged and they really want to know how to actually predict and prevent preeclampsia. So that's fantastic.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much. Bye bye. See you in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye.